Okay, so just as a reminder, research papers were due Tuesday, so if you haven't turned yours in yet, make sure you turn it in ASAP. I haven't looked at any of them yet, but I do plan to start grading this weekend. So today we are going to start talking about economic policy. Sounds like a mouthful, doesn't it? We're going to talk about how the government steps into the economy, what types of steps they take, how we measure our economy, and what happens when the economy crashes. All sorts of fun to be had. Okay. Economic policy is public policy. And when we say public policy, what we're talking about is a government purpose or goal that is supported by various laws, rules, or regulations. For example, if the government wants to clean up the water, then the policy is environmental regulation and is supported by the Clean Water Act, the Environmental Protection Agency, and so on. So the government comes up with a goal and they use laws, regulations, and rules to implement this new goal. So the government does have a fair amount of regulations on things like property rights, contracts, and standards that are designed to facilitate trade and strengthen business ties. National business regulations are necessary because if we left it up to the states, there would be huge inconsistencies. In Texas, the minimum wage might be much lower than California, but there might be weaker workplace safety laws. So it's a way of providing consistent regulations so you know what you have to do if you open a business in more than one state. So there's some standardization and uniformity in terms of businesses. The government will also work to try to provide stability. They'll provide public goods like the interstate system, or I'm trying to think of another example. Things like the interstate, road safety, things like that, to make it easier to move goods and services from one place to another. So they try to provide some stability for the markets, keeping in mind, of course, that the economy is always shifting. It's always going through cycles. And government intervention into the economy is a relatively new phenomenon. We really didn't see mass intervention until the Great Depression. So intervening into the economy has changed over time as the economy has grown, and so have some of the problems that we tend to see in our economy. Have any of you taken an economics class yet? Yeah? Okay. Because if you had, some of this will be familiar to you. Okay. So how do we measure economic growth in this country? How do we determine growth? One of the key factors we look at is called the gross domestic product, or the GDP. And this is the total value of the goods and services produced in the United States. So things like agriculture, cars, computers, and so on. So calculate the total value every year of roughly our gross domestic product, and that can be a way of measuring economic growth. If the GDP has increased, then we know the economy is doing well. If it's gone down, then the economy may not be doing so well. And we saw this happening with the 2008 recession. It was the worst recession since the Great Depression. So economic growth did decrease significantly. The economy did slow down. And there's two basic prerequisites of how we grow the economy. The first is that there has to be strong investment in the economy by consumers, businesses, and the government. So we have to be spending money. Companies have to be spending money. There has to be money going into the economy. The second prerequisite is that there's innovation in terms of new technologies and resources to deal with issues like diseases, cyber hacking, and so on. And the last prerequisite is that there's a productive workforce that's been encouraged because of federal funding in higher education and job training. So you need investment, innovation, and productivity. So the more money the government puts into cross-training people, the better off the economy is going to be. If you have people losing manufacturing jobs, but they're cross-trained in IT, then there's a good chance the economy will still be strong. And there's also protections in place for people who do invest in the economy. The Securities and Exchange Commission, or the SEC as it's also known, requires all publicly traded companies to disclose their stock and bond information, let investors know the risks of investing, and work to prevent fraud. Investing in the economy in any company is risky, but some companies are more risky than others. And we've had companies that have lied to their investors. Enron lied to their investors about the state of the company. So the stock was worth more than the business actually was. So when the business went under, people lost hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars in stock. We don't want that happening. We don't want people being told the stock is worth $200 a share when it's really only worth $50 a share. So the idea is to make it harder for companies to cheat, but also let consumers know, is this a worthwhile investment or not? Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. So if you want to invest in the stock market, you need to do some research on the company, and you need to find out how much of a risk you're taking. Some companies are pretty stable. Amazon's pretty stable, Apple's pretty stable. I wouldn't invest in an oil company right now because of the global pandemic, but usually that's a safe investment. So it's better to know what you're getting into. That way you're not caught off guard if things fall apart. All right, so in terms of innovation, a good example is the National Institute of Health, or the NIH, and its work on medication. The NIH works on things like vaccines. So we've seen the NIH investing in a COVID-19 vaccine. And Pfizer recently announced that their vaccine is at about 90% effectiveness, which means they are getting pretty damn close to having a vaccine ready for the public. So it's important to have that kind of research supported by the federal government. The NIH is also involved in the Human Genome Project. Part of the problem with medication is we don't necessarily know what causes diseases like schizophrenia. So if we could find a genetic component, maybe we could come up with a better medication. Mapping genomes, figuring out where illnesses come into play. And the NIH is also involved in the fight against bioterrorism. The anthrax attack in 2001 showed how unprepared we were to deal with the possibility of terrorists using chemical weapons to attack the public. So they're working to prevent someone from dropping a vial of smallpox in the middle of Times Square and causing all sorts of chaos. And we've seen the federal government stepping into the economy to help provide jobs as necessary. It was during the New Deal that the federal government became a job creator, creating jobs in construction, electricity, the arts, and so on. So this is when we saw the government actually creating jobs, not just trying to support the economy. And with the recession after 2008, over 8 million jobs were lost pretty quickly. So Congress had to pass a stimulus package to keep people working, to help encourage investment into the economy. So when the economy slows down, we do tend to see the government stepping in to try and fix the problem, try to get the economy back on track. But a problem we see constantly is inflation. Inflation is basically the increase in the general level of prices. If you look at the price of a loaf of bread in 2009 and today, you can see the inflation in the price. Inflation has been relatively low since the 1980s, but that doesn't help people on a fixed budget. If you can only afford $100 a month for groceries and a gallon of milk is going to cost you $3.50, that's going to cut into your budget, right? Inflation doesn't help low-income Americans or senior citizens on Social Security. And if inflation goes up, people feel less secure about the economy. They're less willing to spend money. They're not able to buy as much because they don't have as much money to spend in the economy. So the government does try to fight inflation, but unfortunately it happens. It's part of the economy and it's just something we have to try to deal with.
I know a lot of people are saying like if Biden comes in, a lot of people are saying that's going to happen because he's going to raise taxes, or he wants to raise taxes on sports for the first day more a year. And a lot of people are saying for that, a lot of people are saying like, well, have good luck buying $5 chips now. Is that a possibility? Are they just saying that?
They're saying that because they're panicking. The reality is, unless you make at least $400,000 a year, none of our taxes are going to go up. So it's exceedingly unlikely that we'll see inflation going above maybe 1 or 2% increase. So maybe you'll pay $2.75 for a bag of chips as opposed to $2.50, but it's not going to get that high. They're panicking. Yeah, they're panicking. But the economists and even conservative economic think tanks have said it's not going to hurt low and middle income Americans. It's only going to affect the people towards the top. So no, the inflation's not likely to get that bad. Yeah, yeah. No, and it's people tend to panic when politicians talk about raising taxes, and it's understandable. But they don't necessarily look at what they're specifically talking about. All they heard was Biden's going to raise your taxes. If you make more than $400,000 a year, yes. Otherwise, no. So for most people, you're going to be fine. But yeah, well, top 5-7%, give or take, yeah. It's not going to affect most people, but all they've heard for several months is he's going to raise your taxes, so people are panicking. It happens. It happens. Kind of like when Obama was first taking office, people were buying guns because they were told Obama's going to take your guns, and then nothing happened. So, yeah, it happens. But no, not likely to increase inflation. Not impossible, just not likely. Okay, so the government also tries to encourage business development. They try to encourage things like agricultural subsidies, and in the 1800s, giving railroad companies about 100 million acres of land to develop the coast-to-coast rail system. Agricultural subsidies can be beneficial, but they cost us a little over $20 billion. And for the most part, they're not going to small farms anymore. They're going to the larger corporate farming companies. We don't see as many small farms anymore, independent farmers. We've seen them bought up by larger agricultural companies instead. So we're not necessarily bailing out small farmers, we're bailing out the larger companies who may or may not need these agricultural subsidies. And the federal government used grants to help build the interstate system. They built about 900,000 miles of national highways in the 1930s, and another 45,000 miles by the 1950s, end of the 1950s. And it's because of this that you can take oranges from Florida and get them to Texas in a couple of days. That we can move goods across the country. That we can get avocados from Mexico or California, peaches from Georgia, and so on. So it has facilitated the movement of goods across the country, and made it easier for farmers to sell to other markets. This was one of the government's biggest investments in business, was creating the highway system. There's also the Small Business Administration. If you are an independent store owner, you can get a loan to start your business for disaster relief if you get hit by a fire, a flood, a hurricane, and so on. So there's been about $45 billion offered for small companies. Unfortunately, with the recent COVID bailouts, the majority of the money went to large companies and not small companies. Amazon got a bailout. Amazon did not need a bailout. Amazon has made more money this year than it's made in the past couple of years because people stayed home and they had to order stuff. So it should have been going to the small restaurants, salons, things like that, but not as much money was given to them as, quite frankly, should have been. And we have seen the federal government trying to invest in renewable energy. They've spent about $46.5 billion in tax support for solar and wind companies. And you'll see states offering tax discounts to homeowners who put solar panels on their roofs. Sometimes they'll give them a property tax break if they agree to do that. They also are working to increase cybersecurity. You can now use a virtual private network to protect your data. They're trying to prevent major hackings. They do still happen. Our data does sometimes get leaked, but they are working to try to prevent that from happening. The government also will step in to protect employees and consumers. In the 1930s, we got the National Labor Relations Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act. And what they did was they increased workplace security features, not locking doors from the outside, better fire escapes, worker safety features so you don't get your hand mangled by a machine. This is also when we stopped allowing children to work in factories, when we set a fairly minimum age to be able to work in most businesses. And it's also when we established the first federal minimum wage. Now, the minimum wage had its highest value in 1968, but it's lost over 8% of its value since 2009 because it hasn't kept up with inflation. We have not raised the minimum wage in over a decade. And so today, there is no state in the United States where a worker who makes the minimum wage can afford a 2-bedroom apartment by the average of the state rent. So unfortunately, the minimum wage is not anywhere near where it needs to be to keep up with inflation. I'm sorry? Oh, yeah. I mean, economists have said we need to take it up to at least $10 an hour nationally. We're sitting at $7.25 right now. Yeah. We've also seen the creation of the Food and Drug Safety Administration, the FDSA. Have any of you read a book called The Jungle by Upton Sinclair? No, it used to be required reading. Basically, it was a book that exposed the horrifically bad working conditions in meatpacking plants in the early 1900s. And it got President Theodore Roosevelt to create the Food and Drug Safety Administration so our food is actually safe. It's why they have to inspect meat packing plants and factories. And it's why meat has to have that stamp on it that says USDA certified. Because we don't want all sorts of really awful things in our food. It's also why if there's something like E. coli in the lettuce, they pull it off the market as quickly as possible so people don't get sick. Also, protections in place in terms of prescription safety. If you release a new antidepressant and one of the side effects is homicidal rage, that's a problem. To give a more humorous example, when Ambien first came out, the sleeping pill, they didn't realize there was this odd side effect where people would walk in their sleep, eat in their sleep, and drive in their sleep, and have no idea they were actually doing that. Yeah. Yeah, they would actually like go and drive, and they were also sometimes having sex in their sleep and not even realizing it. So that's a problem, right? We don't want that happening. So they've tried to fix those problems, and at least warn people that that might happen. So maybe lock your bedroom door or something. But it's a way of keeping us safe. So we don't want this kind of products on the market. And there's also the Consumer Product Safety Commission that sets standards and lets us know of a potential hazard. Companies are supposed to report any kind of problems to this commission, but they don't always do that. So 3M got into trouble because they hid a problem with an ignition system in their cars, and 13 people were killed in car accidents because the system malfunctioned. So they had to recall 2.6 million cars. There was a federal investigation, and they had to pay millions in fines. So if something happens, like they find a problem with the braking system in a Nissan, Nissan is supposed to let the owners of those cars know, fix the problem for free, and if they can't fix it, recall the cars at no cost to the consumer. So the idea is those safeties are in place to keep us from getting into an accident and having no idea what happened. Okay, so why does the government intervene in the economy? Well, if the economy is not doing well, we tend to blame the politicians in power. And sometimes it is legitimately their fault. And sometimes there's just nothing they can do about it. There's only so much they can do to regulate the economy. If a company lies consistently and cheats, there's not much you can do until you find out there's a problem. So if the economy is not doing well, we tend to blame the people in power. But we saw a change in attitude during the Great Depression when both Democrats and Republicans said, if there's an economic crisis, the federal government has to step in and do something about it. This attitude that the economy will fix itself during the crisis doesn't work. Leaving it up to the states, not going to work. So this is when we saw a change in attitude and a belief that it is the role of the federal government to intervene in an economic crisis. This is when we saw the rise of what's called Keynesian economics. John Maynard Keynes was a British economist, and he was the first to argue that the government can try to stimulate a slow economy by increasing spending or cutting taxes. So he advocated for having the government pump money into the economy to create demand. So for example, earlier this year, the federal government sent most people a stimulus check. And the idea was we would go out and spend that money and that would stimulate the economy. So they look at that and they say the government has to inject money into the economy to turn it around. We do, however, still subscribe quite a bit to the idea of laissez-faire capitalism. This is an idea that originated in the 1800s, that the economy works best when it's left alone. So there are politicians who will argue that if the economy is not doing well, that's because it's overregulated, and we should remove government regulations. So this is where we do tend to see differences between Democrats and Republicans. Republicans think the government should step out of the economy. Democrats don't trust businesses to regulate themselves. So Republicans tend to take a bit of a hands-off approach. Democrats want more oversight into the economy. So for Republicans, they tend to believe that the government should only intervene in a crisis. Otherwise, just let the economy run itself. Any of you heard of Keynesian economics or laissez-faire capitalism? No, not really. Okay. All right. So Republicans tend to focus on what's called supply-side economics. They tend to think that if you cut taxes, there will be higher productivity and higher investments into the economy. So they tend to favor cutting corporate and wealth taxes. There's also disagreements on tax rates. There's this inherent contradiction where on the one hand, the majority of Americans think their taxes are too high. On the other hand, they think the wealthiest aren't paying their fair share in taxes. So which is it? Are taxes too high, or are they not high enough? So there's a little bit of a contradiction in that. Nobody likes paying taxes. Nobody looks at it and goes, it's time to file a tax return, yay! I mean, maybe accountants, but most of us hate taxes. But they're a necessary evil. It's how we fund everything the government needs. So we don't have to like them. But they are a necessary evil. And we tend to see Republicans focusing on cutting spending to reduce the deficit. They usually will want to cut spending on healthcare, welfare, and education, focusing on trying to balance budget. Democrats, on the other hand, want more money for education, healthcare, and infrastructure. So they'll look at it and they'll say, we can't cut taxes, we have to raise them, especially on the wealthy. So you see this contradiction between Republicans saying cut taxes and cut spending, and Democrats saying increase spending and increase taxes. The one area they do agree on is Social Security and Medicare. No politician would ever come out and say, we need to cut funding for these. They wouldn't even get through the primaries if they ever said that. And we tend to look at those and we tend to say, you know what? Senior citizens have worked, they've put their time into the economy. Now they can't work anymore and we should support them. They've done their part. It's our turn to support them. So even though Social Security and Medicare are the most expensive social programs, nobody's advocating for cutting funding. And if it even gets suggested, AARP goes to war with these politicians, and it does not end well. So Democrats and Republicans, when they talk about cutting spending, they never talk about Social Security and Medicare. Basically, they don't ever try to touch that. But we have seen a rising deficit, partly because of tax cuts. George W. Bush cut taxes twice, Trump has cut them once. Tax cuts mean less money coming into the government, which runs up the deficit. We've also been fighting 2 wars for almost 20 years, and wars are expensive. It's not cheap to intervene in another country, and you're always there longer than you think you're going to be. So between tax cuts, putting less money into the treasury, and the high military spending, the deficit has gone up significantly since 2001, 2002. Also, when people talk about the budget, they don't understand that the military spending in the United States makes up the largest portion of the budget. Welfare is about like 1%. The military spending is like 50%. So, there you go. Okay, so it's not just the government who's interested in the economy. We're interested. Interest groups get involved. And when we look at the attitudes of the American people, generally speaking, we do tend to believe that government regulation is more beneficial than harmful. We don't want to go back to unsafe working conditions, contaminated food, businesses that lie to consumers. We don't want another Enron type situation. So for most people, they look at that and they say, you know what, this is actually to our benefit. They keep us from losing our money if our bank collapses. They make sure we don't get hamburger meat that's contaminated with E. coli. So we do tend to agree that government regulation is necessary and more beneficial than harmful. And we've also seen that more than 3/4 of the public believe we do need to increase the minimum wage. In 2014, President Obama asked Congress to increase the minimum wage to $10.10 an hour. And he was supported by the unions, restaurant workers, and others who also advocate for worker safety. But this plan faced mass opposition from the National Restaurant Association, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and congressional Republicans. And because they are more effective at lobbying and public relations, the minimum wage did not go up. So there is high support, but we can't quite get Congress to figure out how to do it. And there is some validity to the claim that it will hurt business owners. Small business owners are impacted by increases in the minimum wage. But the National Restaurant Association tends to represent groups like McDonald's, Pizza Hut, and others. Are they going to be affected by an increase in the minimum wage? No. So, yes, it can hurt small businesses. But Amazon isn't going to be hurt if we increase the minimum wage. Walmart's not going to be hurt if we increase the minimum wage. It's not going to hurt big businesses. There would have to be a way to help small businesses if we did increase the minimum wage. But the large companies, they're going to be fine. Also, we're one of the only countries that has a tipping system for restaurant workers. In most of Europe, they pay them a minimum wage, and so tipping is very small, like maybe the equivalent of $1 or $2. Here, of course, we have to, if you've worked as a server, you have to rely on tips, right? In other countries, they actually pay them a living wage, and so tipping is minimal. You might tip like €2 for good service, but that's considered a pretty high tip. And there's been some debate about whether or not we should fix our tipping system and just go to a straight minimum wage for restaurant workers instead of having them rely on tips. But they go back and forth on that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, some workers complain that then, that they make really good tips. And yeah, in some places you probably would, but yeah, some places you're not going to make good tips.
Especially nowadays.
Yeah. And also sometimes people will lessen a tip for circumstances beyond the server's control. Like, oh, it took half an hour to get my food. Well, if the kitchen's backed up, I mean, it's not their fault, so. Yeah, I don't like the tipping system because I think people tend to abuse it. And I don't like how notoriously unreliable it is. Because one night maybe you make $50 in tips, and the next night you make 5, and it's like, well, that's not ideal. Yeah, I think we should move to a minimum wage and then just kind of do what they do in Europe. Because quality of service there isn't any worse than it is here. I mean, in some ways, it's actually better because they're not relying on a tip, so they're not, Anyway. Okay, so what happens if the economy collapses? 2008, we had the largest recession since the Great Depression. Here's essentially how this recession happened. Mortgage companies and banks were giving people mortgages on houses they could not afford. They give someone a mortgage for a $300,000 house that was beyond someone's price point. And then when that person had moved in, the interest rate would go up. Then that person couldn't pay the loan, they would default, and the house would go into foreclosure. So the housing industry collapsed, which led to the banking industry and Wall Street collapsing, which led to the auto industry collapsing. So we had to have a massive federal intervention to prevent the complete collapse of the economy. So in 2009, Congress passed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. This put $789 billion together to stimulate the economy. So they cut individual and business taxes by $288 billion to encourage spending and job hiring. They provided $195 billion for aid, healthcare, and job training for people who lost their jobs, and $44.5 billion to prevent education cuts and teacher layoffs. The bailout of the auto industry was designed to keep thousands of workers from losing their jobs. And it did help. Some workers did lose their jobs, but the American auto industry did not go under. The national unemployment rate rose to an average of 9.6%. So we had millions of Americans laid off, millions of homes lost to foreclosure, and companies that weren't hiring workers. Part of the problem we saw in 2008 was companies began to realize that one person could do the work of 2 to 3 people in the office. So why would they spend the money on 2 workers when one person can do 2 jobs? So some of that hiring just hasn't come back, and some of it has. And it took quite a while to get out of this recession. We didn't really see the full effects of the economy turn around until about 2015. But again, this was the worst recession since the Great Depression. We were on the verge of going into a very massive depression. So because of these bailouts, we were able to keep some of the economy going. But mortgage companies like Fannie and Freddie Mac went out of business. Lehman Brothers had to get bought out by another Wall Street company. Some banks collapsed. There were questions about banking industry practices. It was pretty ugly. Pretty ugly situation. There was also a secondary problem with homeowners where they had what's called an underwater mortgage, where they owed more on the house than it was worth. So let's say a house was only worth $150,000, but you got a mortgage for $210,000. What that meant is even if you sold your house, you would still owe money to the bank. So people couldn't afford to sell their houses because they'd been valued at more than they were actually worth. So you had a lot of homeowners going, I can't get out of this, because they were overvaluing houses prior to the 2008 recession. And we're starting to see that happening in markets in places like San Francisco, Los Angeles, and South Florida. Before I left Florida, there was this company that was building an 80-story apartment building in Miami where a studio apartment would start at $2,500 a month. There's no way you're going to have that many people moving into that building, right? At some point, the housing market's going to collapse, that building's going to be half empty, and you're not going to make your money off of it. Yeah, studios have no bedroom. It's basically a living room, a kitchen, and a bathroom. Yeah. Yeah. Basically like 500 square feet, give or take. Yeah. Yeah, in Houston, they were building studio apartments on the waterfront that started at $3,300 a month. And in Los Angeles, a basic house goes for $1.1 million. Starting, Yeah, not even a fancy house, just like a basic house that you might see around here. Yeah. So the housing market is in a little bit of a crisis again, and I would not be surprised if it bottoms out in some of those cities where it's just become, there's no way you get to live there. My parents owned a townhouse in the Los Angeles area, and when they decided to move to Texas, they put it on the market and they got a full market value offer in 24 hours of it being on the market. They got a full priced offer within 24 hours. Because anything under $1 million in California goes quick. So they had like 2 offers within 24 hours. So it took them less than a week to sell their house. Yeah. Yeah. It was like an end unit, so only one set of neighbors, there's a pool in the back, no, it didn't take long to sell. So they're calling me and they're like, now we have to find a house in Texas. And we thought this would take longer, and it did not take that long. So it shouldn't be that way. I mean, it's great on the one hand if you're a seller, but it's crappy if you're a buyer and you're like, this place is open, and now it's gone. So in a lot of cities, I think they're going to find the housing market's going to bottom out again. It's just not sustainable. You can't ask people to pay that kind of price. It's not going to work. Okay, any thoughts, questions? No? Okay. So we'll finish chapter 16 on Tuesday. We're going to talk about taxes or lack thereof. I will be working on grading papers this weekend. It's probably going to take me at least another week to get through all of the papers, but if it's going to take me longer than that, I'll let you guys know. The good thing is with Blackboard, you can see your paper grades as soon as I've graded them, so you're not waiting. Like I said, if it's going to take longer, I'll let you know, but hopefully not. Please God, not. So that's it for today. If you have any questions between now and Tuesday, you can email me or call or text